Hello, my name is Drew McCachran, and this is the Cadre's 10-Foot Pole podcast. Welcome back. We'd like to thank Joseph Ong for providing us with the 10-Foot Pole theme song. Just a disclaimer, all the opinions expressed in this discussion are not those of the UPE, are not necessarily those of the UPEI Student Union, and not necessarily those of myself. My name is Drew McCachran, and I'll be hosting this debate discussion over the issue of white privilege. Every so often, academia breaks into popular culture, usually in the form of terms that express certain socio-political ideas. The internet has aided in the spread of such ideas, and one of the most modern, noteworthy contemporary ideas that has kind of spread out because of the internet has been the idea of white privilege. White privilege has exploded into the popular discourse, especially in the face of such issues as police brutality, Ferguson, etc. Here to discuss this issue with me is Dante Bizard, a fifth-year psychology honors student.
That's correct.
And from the Bahamas.
Yes, I am.
Yes. So, Dante, if you'd just like to begin by kind of laying out what you mean by white privilege, why you think it's an important discussion to have, and we'll go from there.
Well, that's the thing. I think we should start with why is it important to us to have before we even start on a definition, because there's a lot of different misconceptions of the concept of white privilege and its correlation with racism and discrimination. These misconceptions lead persons to self-evaluation, like self-evaluating their own life to see if white privilege does truly exist. However, since they have these misconceptions about white privilege, they come to the conclusion that it does not exist, and they have a different view from people of color when it comes to white privilege. And yeah.
Okay. In that case, would you be able to elaborate on the nature of these misconceptions people have and how you would respond to them? In doing so, also kind of expressing what white privilege is itself.
Well, yeah. So coming from the definition of white privilege, persons usually have a misconception that it means you will automatically have the advantage in every way for just not for being white. These are true in some certain areas, but it's more of systematic. In terms of, for instance, you would be more likely to obtain a job or an interview because of the color of your skin, or you get a longer sentence in the prisons if you committed the same exact crime as a person of color or a white person. That's the kind of thing we talk about white privilege. However, people think white privilege means that you would get, say, a lump sum of money more over a black person just because you're a white, but it's more of how society sees few people of color, rather.
So, just for clarification, would you say that in that case, people consider white privilege as being elevated because you are white, whereas a more appropriate way to look at it might be from the reverse, that white people are kind of the baseline of society, and that it's people of color who are put down or at a disadvantage from not being white?
Well, especially in the Western Hemisphere, white is the norm. If you're not taking part in white culture, and especially in the Western Hemisphere, then you were going against that norm, you're seen as different. So from that perspective, then you're a other in the Western society. This especially rings true for international students who come over who are not quite in culture in white society, in white culture. Again, say if it's a white society, that means it's not entirely against a person of color, but at the same time, we have to adapt in certain ways because how society and white culture view us.
Some people often like to respond to assertions of the prevalence of white privilege by switching the focus to class and economic issues. The poor white person seems to be often kind of the counterexample given against that. How would you you've kind of touched on those claims, but how would you respond to a specific example like that, as well as the intersection between class and race?
Well, historically, class has not had much of a hand in the issue of race, in the sense that, well, for example, I remember watching a YouTube video at some point, and there's this actor. He has money, he drives a nice car, and he was pulled over by a police officer for, I can't remember the reason it was for, but he got a little bit of harassment from the police officer, and it was entirely because of the color of his skin. And these kind of things happen to many people of color disproportionately compared to other races. So it doesn't really matter your class, really. What they see first is your skin color, because they don't see the money. They can't physically see the money. They physically see your skin color.
You mentioned before, you kind of specified that white privilege is specifically an issue in the Western Hemisphere, especially in countries like Canada or America, where the majority of the population is white,
Right.
and being white is seen as the norm. Would you say that white privilege also exists as a global phenomenon in some ways? Can there be other forms of privilege in other societies?
I mean, in terms of class, you always have privilege over the poor, but when it comes to race, yes, it is a global phenomenon. Like I said, it's systematic. It's a system held in place not just in Canada or in America, U.S. There's white privilege in the Caribbean. There's white privilege in Asia. There's white privilege in Africa. There's white privilege in Europe. If you go anywhere in the world on the map, you can't really escape it. And then again, white privilege does not discriminate against class and gender, as you were saying before. I remember when the incident with Oprah in some European country, and the lady at the store refused to show her bag, and this is Oprah. She's like a billionaire, you know what I mean? And it's just because that she was black. She thought that she could not afford it.
Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on some of the examples you gave? So, for example, you mentioned Asia and Africa, which has a majority black population that many people might find strange that you would assert that. Would you feel free to elaborate on what you mean by that, and if it is expressed in cultural ideas or in systemic political structures, kind of these transnational political structures, or if it exists in both those things?
So I'm going to start with South Africa, for instance. For example, South Africa. South Africa had years of apartheid, which was, the segregation between whites and blacks and what they call colored. Things like education. There was a separation there, just like how it was in the U.S. with the segregation or the Jim Crow laws. Also, how you can have interracial relationships that was literally illegal. You know what I mean? Those are kind of things, that affected the daily lives of people of color back then. However, even when that stopped, you could still see the differences. You see a lot of the black South Africans in poverty because of the result of what happened during apartheid. And in terms of Asian culture, it's the exact same thing as it is in Canada. It's ingrained in them that being darker is considered to be, bad, kind of thing. Yeah. Am I allowed to give some examples of my own life to this?
Yeah,
too?
sure.
Because my own experience I'm dating an Asian girlfriend now. I dated someone before that, and a part of the reason why we broke up is because her family couldn't accept me because that I was black. They could not get over that fact at all. Even going into this current relationship, I had to keep that in mind as a factor. Now, I'm not gonna say that in all interracial relationships they have to consider this fact. But I wonder how disproportionately that people of color have to think about this compared to if you had a white interracial couple. You know what I mean? And I'm not gonna say I'm a perfect person, but I rather be judged for the content of my character, but I rather be judged for my skin color. And then you have things like the skin bleaching industry, right? It's like, especially in Asia, they want to be closer to that color as well. So it's also internalized racism as well.
Could we take it back to Africa for a moment and maybe look at a country like Nigeria that is in a slightly different situation than South Africa in that, albeit it was also colonized, did not have a sizable white minority that held political power, but instead had the black majority having political power. Would you say that there is still white privilege of a sort in a country such as that?
It wouldn't be quite as evident because there's not as much white people, but in some ways it's still there. Because again, it's not like white privilege just, it's been there for a while. It didn't just go away just because there are more black people than white people there. So again, I use an example, in the Bahamas, the majority there is black. However, I've been stopped by police officers going home because where I live is predominantly white. You know what I mean? Because I don't belong there, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, even so, if the majority is black, even in Nigeria, if they had, black people say, "Oh, I want to move in this areas now," as people call white-topias, how easy would that be? It would not.
Now, a lot of the discussion of an issue of white privilege, some people might ask, to put it a little bit flippantly, what is the point of discussing white privilege? To clarify exactly the question I'm asking is, would you say that discussing white privilege is merely a theoretical issue describing the nature of social reality for many people? Or can it provide the basis for some kind of socio-political change, or at least the movement towards socio-political change, the recognition of white privilege?
Definitely for social political change. Some people just say it's just a term, but this is something that happens, daily. And again, if you want to talk in terms of how this is going to enhance the agenda of racism and discrimination, that's the whole point. If you realize your white privilege, you can use that to say, okay, I'm in this space where I realize that I have these unearned advantages and privileges that people of color don't have. So I'm going to try my best to educate persons on this, and also use this to make sure that I do not expel my prejudice and my discrimination against people of color. And then, in terms of like in government, there's a lot of, we need social reforms in government. At least Canada, for example, treatment of Aboriginals. If we put in discussion of white privilege towards the treatment of Aboriginals, there could be a change in how they are treated in Canada.
A lot of what you've talked about, and please correct me if I'm misstating this in any way, seems to imply that white privilege is systematically structured into the foundations of modern society. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In that regards, what is the way out of white privilege, in a way, if it is structured in the foundations of society? How can somebody escape that? What changes can be made? And what would the nature of those changes need to be? Does there need to be some kind of revolutionary break? Can you take aspects of the current system and try to find ways to change their, to use a more philosophical term, inherent logic? Can you reform existing expressions of politics to remove them of any remaining white privilege or any kind of racial privilege or discrimination?
We have to realize that it exists. That's the first step. Because we have to realize that there is a problem to solve the problem. And then once we realize there is a problem, which is the white privilege, see, here's the thing. The problem is, even when we realize there is white privilege, the problem with then acknowledging it is that, can we see it in every context possible? Because then you would see, like, certain police brutalities, different kinds of forms of racism and discrimination. And can we outwardly say, that is racism. This is discrimination. This is white privilege. Because nowadays society is not socially desirable to seem prejudiced or to, act discriminatory against people of color. And as so, it's hard to identify this kind of things, which is going to be even more difficult for the social reform. Because we can't identify it, how can we then put other rules into place to solve this problem? And then for companies that discriminate against people of color, they need to the government needs to have policies in place for these companies to change those kind of policies. For instance, some companies make it out to hire certain type of people. Put in quotations, you can't really see me, but to meet a certain agenda. And that discriminates against not just people of color, but also white people as well. Because I know some companies would do, or even like things like affirmative action. Like I understand that it's used to combat the racism and discrimination, but at the same time, if you're putting people just because of the color of their skin, that in itself is also discrimination and racism, systematically. But yeah, that's the only way we can change it. If we have to acknowledge it, and then we have to be able to recognize it in every situation possible in order to solve the problems in every different category that it falls in.
Some people seem to react to the prevalence of white privilege by promoting a kind of reaction against it. But what I mean by this is, for example, you mentioned Aboriginals in Canada. There's been several different reactions, intellectual backlashes against the prevalence of white privilege. So some people have suggested trying to build a new kind of relationship with Aboriginals in Canada through existing social systems. However, there are people like Taiki Alfred, who is a indigenous thinker at a university in British Columbia, I believe. He wrote a book, Wasese. I forget the subtitle of it, but it was basically talking about ways of re-engaging with Aboriginal culture. But if I am correct in interpreting it, it seemed to have a firm rejection of engaging with elements of settler society, as he called it. Similarly, in the States, you sometimes saw the emergence of black nationalists or organizations like the Nation of Islam that tried to disengage from white culture in a reaction to the prevalence of white privilege. Would you say that that instead of coming at it from that angle, should there be an attempt towards reconciliation, but even more than just reconciliation, some kind of mutual engagement between races?
That's the word I was looking for, mutual engagement, because if you really look at it, all those policies, and even, like, again, affirmative action, that still promotes the separate but equal agenda. Now, the problem with that is that what they're trying to do with these kind of policies is, again, retribution, but they don't want to integrate their culture with our culture. It's still a us versus them kind of thing. We owe them something. Once you give them that thing, then it's done. That's all it is. But it's a mindset that needs to change, and it needs to be a mutual integration.
Would you, when you mean mutual integration, would you agree with this example/analogy I might give? I've kind of thought about, I found it interesting, the acceptance of Christianity, actually, among many African American communities especially. Because when you think of it, Christianity originally came as a colonial imposition.
Right.
Christianity did not exist in the areas of Africa where most slaves came from. I believe a lot of them were Muslims previously, or followers of traditional religion in some way. And yet, despite the fact that Christianity began as a colonial, primarily white imposition, people were able to adopt elements of Christianity to create a kind of liberating force, let's say. Martin Luther King Jr. is the go-to example of black liberation movements who was a reverend and used Christianity as a vehicle for emancipatory radical social change. And when you said the integrating of cultures, would you say that kind of using, not necessarily basing it on a Christian foundation, but kind of taking that same idea as to finding ways to engage in the existing culture and trying to... What I'm more asking is, instead of necessarily going to the past or something like that, we're in the present, and unfortunately, there seems to be no way... The present has colored the way we view things, correct? That racial discrimination, white privilege, has been entrenched in the current social situation. So would you say that kind of based on these ideas, would you say, or at least hold out the hope, that there is some way through mutual engagement and reconciliation that people of different colors can try to create a culture out of the existing culture that, well grounded in this past, can ultimately transcend what it was to become something new?
You have to be accepting of differences. Okay, to go back to the whole the Christianity thing. What was the point about that?
Yeah. So sorry for being long-winded, but sometimes that's a problem with me. But I was kind of using that as an example of something which was entrenched into a culture based on racial hierarchies, that it was an alien imposition by a conquering colonial culture onto a group of people.
Yeah.
But even though it had its roots in this colonial imposition, this very unjust, we would say, imposition, people were able to take that and what they were given and the culture that this new imposition created for them,
okay,
and take that and be able to use it, ironically enough, as a vehicle against the very oppression that imposed it in the first place.
You know what that just sounds like the N-word. You know why? Because that's exactly what black people did. White people use it as a form of oppression, then we turn it around against them, use it as a form of brotherhood. And then the minute we told them that, you cannot say this word, then it's an uproar. The thing about the Christianity thing is that it's how you interpret it. It's not Christianity in itself that oppressed us. It was the use of Christianity that oppressed us. They could have done it with any other religion. Buddhists could have done, the Buddhists could have done it. The Muslims could have done it. But it just happened so that it was from the Europeans, and Europeans' number one religion was Christianity. Because even by saying that, then you have to also say, well, what about the Crusades and that kind of thing? Those are also examples when they have literally used violence in the name of Christianity. The thing is, that does not mean that we have accept those views, even though we call ourselves Christians. Because our view of Christianity is different from where their view of Christianity was. Because their view was to shove it down our throats, make us forget all of our culture, and call that Christianity. But that's not what we call Christianity. We might worship the same God and that kind of thing. But I kind of see what you mean with the inclusion of culture and that kind of thing. But that's not exactly what I was getting at, because that form of inclusion came out of suffering. And I think that's exactly what the Aboriginals are going through now, because their land was taken away from them. And then, they were placed on reserves and these residential schools. And now to go to them and say, come into our culture, they're already into your culture. They don't have that culture anymore. Where are they coming back from? Nothing. They don't have anything anymore. They don't have their heritage anymore. Just even for me, my last name is not even my own last name. My last name is Bizarre, but that's not my last name. Turn comes to find out that was my slave owner's name, who's still in France right now. Okay, so to tell them, you're not bringing two cultures together in that sense. We're already in that culture. What we're asking for is to be, okay, fine, you brought us in our culture, but now accept us for who we are now. If you want, you already brought us there. And then you brought us there, and now you're still telling us that we're not good enough because of the color of our skin. Well, okay, we be Christians, we can't turn white. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. So, like I said again, it's more about respecting the differences instead of being like, oh, that's weird, that's different, and stop being scared of differences. That's the next thing too. We have to be accepting of it, not be scared of it. And in that way, if you accept differences, then there could be a change, because then that's when you have true integration. But what they did back then, that was not integration. That was oppression. And that's why we still have this now. Because you realize, because of that, there's a reason why we're in this predicament today. From those ideologies. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Just coming off of that, though, I think the question still remains, though, is, today the social system is still the result of oppression, correct? And you could even say promotes suffering, correct? Just as how, as you said, that's where the Christianity thing came out of.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the way through that if you reject the Christianity example because of it came out of this foundation, how can there ever be true integration when this foundation is implicit in any social system we are living in right now? Basically, what is the way around that? Or is it just, or does it need to be, as you said, kind of this recognition of the problem, and in some way kind of a radical break from the connections in society to be able to accept and recognize these differences?
I have this conversation with one of my friends recently, and we had a really long discussion about this, and we came to the conclusion that, where do we start? And his question to me was, do we start from, tackling the ignorance of the oppressors? Or do you talk to the oppressed? And I think we have to start from the end, because we cannot liberate someone who think they're not oppressed. Okay? It's the same notion as the house slave. We have a lot of those in today's society where they don't even realize themselves that they are oppressed. Then how can we then be together? We need to come together as one from our own categories now. Since they are established, we need to come together as our categories and have this common interest of equality to then take it to the agenda of I would say the white agenda, to then promote equality among other races. But even among minorities, we don't have equality. As we've talked about before, Asia is a prime example of that, and their view against people of color. So I mean, until we can even have integration with the minorities, how can you have integration with the majority? That's impossible.
Anyway, I think we're running out of time on this discussion. Is there any kind of final summation or any final statement you'd like to make?
No, I think I've talked about everything I want to talk about today.
Okay, yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. Once again, this was Dante Bazard discussing the issue of white privilege with the Cadre's 10-Foot Pole podcast. See you soon.